All right. So today's webinar is on practical ways to optimize your technology stack in 2018, and this is based on an enterprise imaging playbook that we recently produced based on our years of experience of working in this corner of the market. Today's speakers are Florent Saint-Clair, our Executive Vice President, and Chris Radi of Foundation Radiology Group, where he serves as Senior Vice President of IT. He will be presenting on his experience in working with Dicom systems over the past 5 years. I am Taylor Ngo, I'm the Marketing Manager, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. We also have Dmitry Tochenik on hand. He's the president and CTO of Dicom Systems, and he'll be available to answer some of your questions at the end, especially the more technical ones. As I mentioned earlier, we are happy to accept questions throughout the webinar. We're just going to set aside time at the end to answer them all. Please feel free to address which speaker you'd like to answer the question. And just use the box in your GoToWebinar dashboard to type it in, and everyone will be able to see it. All right, so imaging data is really at a cross-section of outcomes research and patient care today. We're all dependent on fast, efficient, and reliable access to imaging data. It's so essential to patient care and will continue to be. And this is where Dicom Systems comes in to really be able to support fast and efficient access to patient data. I'll hand it over to Florent at this time to discuss what we're going to be covering in today's webinar.
Thank you so much, Taylor. So I'll be coming in to present the second part of this presentation. I will introduce Chris in just a moment to present the first, second, and third pieces of this presentation on routing, prefetching, and workflow automation. So essentially, some of the takeaways that you're going to get from this presentation are that we, as a company with our customers, are very much focused on solving the IT challenges associated with keeping these workflows alive. So in this industry, whether you go to RSNA, HIMSS, or SIM, or any of the major enterprise imaging focused shows, a lot of the emphasis is placed on the needs of the physicians, the needs of the diagnosticians in how they serve the patient population. And of course, that ultimately is our goal as well. The issue is that for many, many years, the industry was so focused on pulling together the right user interfaces for the physicians and tool sets for the physicians that the IT staff and network engineers expected to keep these workflows alive were given very little to work with. So the analogy I can give you is they were very much like MacGyvers trying to keep workflow alive with whatever they could, whatever tools they could. And so when Dmitry started the company 9 years ago, the experience that we had as colleagues was serving military workflows and helping the military move massive amounts of imaging data from the war theater into the continental US so that images for wounded soldiers could be read effectively. And we learned a lot of lessons in that experience. Moving massive amounts of data with very little bandwidth and a lot of latency has a lot of challenges. And that means that IT knowledge and network knowledge and telecommunications knowledge have a huge role to play in how these workflows can be enabled and maintained over time. And so very important in everything we do, we are the plumbers to the enterprise industry, enterprise imaging industry. And so that is the perspective that we are going to give you in this presentation. So Chris Radi will go into how his enterprise, the enterprise he's responsible for, is leveraging our technology to do efficient routing. Something as simple as routing can be a very sophisticated environment. The ability to present the right images to the right physician at the right time in the right place, and only presenting things to them that are relevant are some of the challenges that are routinely faced by teleradiology or radiology groups in any environment, whether it's the US, Canada, Europe, Middle East, the same challenges occur. And then automation of processes can be a very finicky problem to solve as well. And so where we find that PACS administrators and network engineers are having to intervene routinely to change workflows, to make manual transformations on the data is really quite remarkable. And so Chris will be able to show you some of that. And then the integration side is really key. So for 20, 25, sometimes 30 years in a row, IT choices are made. Different technologies are deployed. Those technologies are still there. They are routinely having to integrate with new systems, right? New generations of systems that speak different standards, new Dicom devices having to talk to old technology having to talk to new EMRs, workflow engines are changing over time. And so our challenge as IT experts is to make sure that all of these investments made by our customers continue to be useful instead of having to do major forklift upgrades to their infrastructure. So integration points, interoperability is another major point that we need to look at. And then something as trivial as Dicom modality worklist, we honestly did not think was, as a company, something that we really needed to pay a lot of attention to until some of our customers came to us with workflow requests that really should have been handled by their PACS vendor or their VNA vendor, but continued to be problematic. And so we became experts at solving enterprise workflows for Dicom modality worklist in a way that saves a lot of time to the technologists and reduces the number of manual interventions required to run patients through. And last but not least, kind of the brave new world of artificial intelligence is something that we're going to touch on. We as a company don't develop artificial intelligence. In fact, we're skeptics when it comes to what you call something called artificial intelligence. A lot of people are using that term very loosely just so that they have some relevance in this new world. But there are some very important steps that need to be taken by an imaging enterprise in order to participate in machine learning. And so we don't talk about AI as much as we talk about neural networks and the ability to develop algorithms based on data that we provide. So we as a company are focused on, in partnership with Google, providing the raw data that research organizations need in order to effectively train these algorithms. And so at this point, I'd like to hand the presentation over to Chris. Chris, we're very grateful that you were able to make time for this presentation with us today. So Taylor, please go to the next slide and let's give the floor to Chris.
Thank you, Florent. Thank you, Taylor. So I wanted to take some time, and I was happy to be asked to participate on this webinar, and I wanted to share our experience with the group. So Foundation Radiology Group, this slide is just a little bit about us. We read about 1.5 million studies per year. We're based out of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and our focus since we were founded in 2008 has been bringing academic level quality and process to community healthcare. So all of our hospitals are community hospitals, or almost all of our hospitals are community hospitals. And the way we deliver our services is through a blend of on-site radiologists at the hospitals and centralized teleradiologists reading subspecialty cases or covering stat shifts. We do all that from a single platform. So we are challenged, the IT team here at Foundation is challenged with bringing data from 40 different PACS platforms into a single PACS platform. centrally and making all of that information available to our radiologists to read. So you can understand that can be a bit of a challenge, and we actually engaged and began looking for providers who could help us solve some of the challenge we were facing about 5 or 6 years ago. So in the next slide, we can talk a little bit about one of the challenges that we tried to solve utilizing Dicom systems. The first is basic intelligent image routing. So this is how to get the studies from the client PACS platform into our PACS platform. It sounds pretty easy. When you distill it down to just a few key points, it gets a little bit more complicated. The first has to do with speed and reliability. So Foundation has many of our community hospitals are in areas in which connectivity is not prevalent. So we struggle at times getting good bandwidth from our client sites, and how can we route the right studies across the most urgent cases first was an important factor. So prioritization was important, such that we got the most urgent cases first. The next was the amount of data we were passing. Could we use some sort of lossless compression in our transfer to help speed up the process? So Dicom Systems was able to help there as well. And we went from a tool that had really limited set of rules. So the tool we were using previously was essentially a Dicom router that had no intelligence, and the tool would not allow us to set different priorities for current exams, prior exams. The queue would essentially get full and could get backed up as a result of routine cases coming in ahead of stat cases. And what we found with the Dicom Systems platform was that through the routing rules engine, we were able to create a set of rules, not very complex, that would allow us to achieve or meet the demands of our organization. There's a couple examples. I think one of my favorite examples is, I'm not sure if there's anyone out there running Fuji PACS, but if you have a Fuji plain film, Fuji CR and a Fuji PACS, when those two get together and you try to export that data out of Fuji PACS, we found that we were having a lot of problems with the format in the Dicom. So what we did was we put a Dicom Systems device between the CRs and the Fuji PACS, and we were able to fork a copy of the pre-modified images, the pre-reformats, to Foundation, and then the PACS platform at the client hospital was still able to get the same data. Dicom Systems simply sent 2 copies, one to us, one to them, and that solved a challenge we were having for a number of months. So, it doesn't necessarily have to be the most complicated or interesting challenge, but one that's certainly impactful that we found solutions to. So I think that's my summary on basic routing. Maybe we could go to the next slide and talk a little bit about prefetch. So relevant prior images are something that I'm sure we all struggle with from time to time. Imagine being responsible for making sure all the priors were available, when supporting 40 hospitals. It's pretty tricky. It's pretty challenging. And because our hospitals are not in a single IDN or in a single large hospital group, we have inconsistent data among all of our hospital sites. So procedure descriptions, procedure codes, they are not consistent. Dicom modality worklist is sometimes adopted, sometimes partially adopted, sometimes not that well. And the challenges we're facing with Prefetch was getting the right images, the right priors, in the amount of time that we had to get them. Previously, our tool only allowed us to fetch based on a modality match. So obviously that doesn't work most of the time. And when we would have missing prior examinations, we would need to contact our client and ask them to manually push cases to us. Now, this is a number of years ago, but you can imagine all the hospital technologists with all the work that they have to do, also having to push cases to a radiology group. That wasn't their idea of a good time. So we needed to find a solution that would allow us to more intelligently fetch prior examinations. So when we first engaged with Dicom Systems 5 years ago, this was one of the key challenges we wanted to solve. And over time, we have built a solution that works almost universally with our client base. It requires a little bit of tweaking for certain customers, but it is an algorithm that we've developed that takes into account procedure description, matching that. It matches body part. Even if the body part Dicom flag is not set, it will still match body part. And then we can put up additional rules in based upon modality and other things. Florent, do you think this would be a good time to show that configuration?
No, absolutely. And I actually have a quick question for you before you do. So
Sure.
I was literally before this webinar presenting to a group on the East Coast. And one of the questions that came up from one of the radiologists was how are the image lifecycle management rules managed, right? So if you're reading remotely for another group or for a hospital, what happens to the image lifecycle management rules of those relevant priors? Because depending on what packs you're running, you may have a pricing model that could make it so onerous to bring in and keep those images that you don't want to do that. And so the ability to manage this flood of data, right? In some cases, you might have 10 relevant priors that you're bringing in. And if you're doing mammography, that's going to definitely impact your storage. What is the ability to do image lifecycle management on those relevant priors? And the answer to that is it depends on what packs you're using, because different packs handle those things differently. Some packs are good at image lifecycle management, others aren't. So how do you handle that at Foundation Radiology? What do you choose to do with those relevant priors once you're done reading?
Sure. So Foundation made a decision, I want to say 5 years back, that we wanted to keep and store as many images as we could possibly. Now, not every client is comfortable with that. Some have specific rules about deletion and retention. But where possible, we're trying to store as many of those images as possible. The thought behind that for us was disk is not that expensive, and this is certainly before Tomo existed, so keep that in mind. But disk is not terribly expensive, and if we have a prior image, it costs us and allows us to provide a service level, an improved service level, if that image is inside of our packs versus us having to continually prefetch it over and over again. So we chose to store those images and retain them. And where we can't, we use our PACS platform, our VNA, to delete, upon the rules set by the client. But an interesting part about prefetching, and this is kind of how it ties in, if you're facing a challenge like ours, one of the nice things about the prefetching rules within Dicom Systems is you can tell it, hey, don't fetch anything that was imaged after a certain date. So if you think about it, if Foundation is the exclusive provider for radiology for a hospital since 2012, and we're keeping everything, it wouldn't make sense to fetch for priors from 2014 because they're already in our VNA. So that is a way in which Dicom Systems can help reduce network utilization, reduce time and congestion within the router itself, and allow you to only fetch what you really don't have or what you really need.
Great. Yeah, Taylor, if you wouldn't mind showing the slide with the actual prefetch algorithm. There you go. So this is something Chris can speak to probably better than we would, because they now manage this without us, right? So the original algorithm was built in partnership with the physicians at Foundation Radiology. And this essentially is a piece of the workflow that augments the routing rules. So when we prefetch, this algorithm is there to filter out anything that really should not be moved, right? So if you're looking at an MRI of the brain, I guess it would be very irrelevant for you to look at an X-ray of the knee that the patient had 5 years ago. It's not something that you need to be looking at. So, Chris, how did we create this with your physicians?
Yeah, so we built a committee. We came up with, knowing that we have inconsistent procedure description data, and knowing that most of our customers were not using body part flag within the Dicom header, we sat down with them and said, all right, well, let's look at the universe of procedure descriptions that we're receiving, and let's come up with a list of synonyms inside of that description that might mean head. So we would say, well, head, you might see brain, you might see neck, whatever. And we came up with those various synonyms. And the code here looks a little bit daunting, but really all this is saying, all right, well, let's match. If it's this type of study, here are all the different synonyms you might see. And these are the types of exams we're going to want to prefetch for that scenario. That way, we're not just saying, hey, just fetch every other plain film or every other modality match. If you've got an ankle and a chest, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense to fetch. So through trial and error and through some work, we were able to come up with this matching algorithm that's really pretty basic. From the intelligence of it, from the difficulty in writing the algorithm, the work really went into coming up with a list of synonyms. The implementation of the code is fairly straightforward. And that's something that we tune and tweak over time. As new clients come in, they may have other phrases or terms that we need to add, but generally speaking, this has been pretty reliable for us.
That's great. And can you speak to the transformation side? How sometimes the patient ID might be coming in with extraneous digits, and you need to transform those things on the way?
Sure, absolutely. So another topic that we're going to cover today, which is play number 3, is Dicom transformations. And you can see on the left side of your screen here, this is an example of a transformer in the Dicom systems tool. Now, the way that you're looking at these screens, this isn't how they're laid out in the application itself, but these are just snapshots. But if you look, these rules are pretty straightforward. What you can see is you can describe the rule, you can decide when it's going to trigger, you can add filters for source and local devices, etc. But essentially, this rule was put in place to delete leading zeros. Right, that's a common problem that we found with many hospitals is the PACS has an MRN that has leading zeros, and the RIS has an MRN that does not include leading zeros. And this becomes a challenge, especially when you're moving from legacy systems to perhaps Epic or Cerner or some new platform, and you have a mismatch in MRN. So for Foundation, we'd like to have those two things consistent in our platform. So what we do is we apply a rule like this one that basically says delete all leading zeros when it's from a certain place. And it's basic regular expressions. You guys can all see the Dicom header field there that we're modifying, and that's it. It's fairly straightforward, but if you couple these rules together, or if you add scripts that can do perhaps lookups or take information from Dicom or HL7, you can do some pretty powerful things. Another example of a transformation rule that we built was we had a client that was migrating PACS platforms. We needed to prefetch the old system, migrate the MRN, and then store it in our PACS. So the migration of MRN, for those images we were prefetching, had to happen real time. So we were able to write a rule that accepted an HL7 message that included the new and the old MRNs, and we could migrate or transform that information in the Dicom in real time. Maybe, Taylor, if we could go back to the slide, play number 3. Yeah, here we go. So the other thing that was really helpful to Foundation was essentially eliminating some manual process. So I talked already about one manual process that we eliminated with the hospitals and calling them and asking them to push priors to us. Some other things that we were doing is routing of secondary captures. So when we read memo cases offline or offsite with our clients, we need to send them back secondary captures. So this process, the secondary capture is triggered on our PACS platform, and then the Dicom systems tools know where they need to go based upon a series of rules and route those secondary captures back to the client. That way, that patient's record remains intact on the client hospital system. The other thing is prioritization of exams I talked about. This is highly important when you're facing compressing turnaround time commitments and needing to get the right studies first. And we were able to do that with Dicom systems. We talked about data migrations and transformations. The last part that we've enjoyed, it's not exactly replacing a manual technology, but it certainly helps us, is if needed, we can go into the Dicom systems platform, we can see the queue, we can manage the queue. If the queue is backing up for some reason, or if we have if a client decides to send us 100 cases that we never asked for or don't want, we can deprioritize those. And lastly, we can manually query retrieve through this tool. So we'll be able to go and look for things that perhaps don't match the MRN or might not match the prior fetch logic, but we need it anyway. So those are some of the examples of the manual processes that we've been able to eliminate.
Very good. Taylor, I think we're ready to move to the next play. So thank you so much, Chris. We'll come back to have more discussion on some of your use cases after we go through plays 4, 5, and 6. So play 4 goes into the complexity of virtually any enterprise imaging environment these days. And the first level of difficulty that we encounter when establishing a footprint with a new customer is that even the definition of enterprise imaging is different for most customers. So depending on who is driving the decision making for the acquisition of a new PACS or a new VNA, enterprise imaging means different things to different people. And for some people, it's the ability to do cardiology, radiology, dermatology, and I don't know, genomics within the same environment. In other cases, really, and this is mostly the reality of enterprise imaging today, is imaging is an important data-intensive subset of the enterprise in general. And so enterprise imaging to us is making sure that the super important component of patient healthcare, which is their imaging, fits correctly within the overall enterprise. Because when a CIO is looking at imaging, they're having to think about imaging as a portion of a much larger picture. And that's one of the issues we have in this industry, is that vendors that are so focused on imaging tend to forget that they are not the center of the world for a CIO. And so interoperability may or may not be, their first thing in their mind when they're designing a new system or a new interface. And so where we come in is easing the pain to connect all of these systems that have been acquired over the years. And it's almost like an archaeological dig, right? When we establish a new server, we don't know what we don't know until we take inventory of what are we connecting to. And so our ability to do our job and unify the enterprise imaging environment is contingent upon our ability to see what else exists. And it's funny, but it's not funny at the same time. And in some cases, finding out what a server does in an older infrastructure requires unplugging it to find out what consequences that will have. And that just speaks to how, in some cases, little documentation of interfaces can exist. And so that's one of the most important lessons that we've learned and that we try to go through with our clients, is to make sure that they have extremely meticulous documentation of not only the various IT systems they've acquired, but how they interrelate with one another. What are the interfaces? Because as you know, there's a lot of turnover in just about any department, any industry, but specifically when it comes to Epic implementations, a lot of the people that are going to come in and create those interfaces are not there permanently. They're going to be there maybe for 2-3 years. They're going to create a bunch of interfaces for you, and maybe they're not going to be well documented, and then they're gone. And then who's going to maintain them? And so documentation is really key, and our systems are there to make sure that your ability to recover from a disaster is not encumbered by lack of documentation. So that's one of the keys. And so we as a plumber of Dicom and HL7 data rely very much on our client's ability to point us in the right direction to deploy our system, and what vendors we need to talk to integrate with, and how willing those vendors are to play ball with us in those integration. Taylor, would you forward to the next slide, please? Thank you so much. So let's talk about an enterprise-grade modality worklist. So again, you know, worklist is not a new concept in enterprise imaging. It's been around for as long as there've been digital or modalities communicating via digital means, via Dicom. So providing worklist is not necessarily a challenge. Providing worklist on a massive scale to potentially thousands of modalities across a complex network, that could be problematic. And so you can't take a departmental approach to worklist when you're running an enterprise with multiple worklists or multiple departments trying to share the same resources. And so we routinely see this in large environments where, you know, a $2 million MRI scanner is going to be shared among multiple departments or among multiple facilities. So how do you ensure that these multiple departments are able to place their own orders in their own either cardiology information system or RIS or EHR, and that all these worklists are going to work correctly without manual intervention? And so one of the things we found, and this is one of the biggest challenges, and I think Chris touched on that in the mammography space, is that once you've created the primary exam, rightfully so, that worklist entry is supposed to drop off, and it's not supposed to be cluttering the worklist with a technologist. And so most worklists are designed to, you know, once you mark an exam as complete in the modality, it drops off that list. And so what happens is the next day or 2 days later, new object is created, whether it's a secondary capture or a 3D object, or perhaps images, visible light image, video, maybe it's an endoscopy study on a Stryker device or an Olympus camera. You know, all of these workflows require access to accurate patient demographics. And so the way we solve those issues is by providing a secondary capture and a tertiary capture worklist environment for mobile devices and for secondary capture devices, so that those devices are able to query the same information that was originally available for the primary modality without having to create a separate manual order just to add objects. And so the advantage is that now you're going to have the same accession number and the same study instance UID available to those devices. So let's talk a little bit about visible light imaging. It's almost inevitable these days that physicians are bringing their own devices into the hospital. And it's a matter of policy whether or not the hospitals let them use their iPhones specifically within those workflows. But it's definitely not something that the hospitals can ignore anymore. And so we have several instances of clients that have deployed their own fleets of iPads for their physicians to use, either in teaching workflows or in routine documentation of patient encounters, specifically in dermatology, in vascular surgery, endoscopy, like we mentioned, and wound care, right? ER cases where a physician needs to take a picture of a wound, and then not having to manually enter the patient demographics when you're doing visible light imaging is huge because you're a busy doctor in an ER. So you don't want to spend your time looking for the patient demographics. They need to be available through the mobile device. That's another kind of problem that we've solved for some of our customers. So Worklist has a lot of different dimensions, not just the ability of the PACS to take an HL7 order and turn that into a modality worklist entry. And we found that empirically. And again, until you're faced with these workflows, in a concrete manner, it's hard to figure out what you're going to need to do with these workflows. And there's no such thing as a cookie cutter approach. Even two separate instances of an Epic EMR within the same health system. We ran into that with one of our customers in Northern California. They have Epic in two different hospitals that belong to the same health system, and they have some pretty dramatic differences within their Epic implementations. And so that has a direct impact on our ability to provide Worklist in those two organizations. Taylor, let's go to the next slide, please.
Sure.
Thank you. So let's talk briefly about machine learning. Some of you have read some of the blog posts that we've done in the past few months. We have a specific blog post series on the subject of machine learning and AI. And in fact, I was privileged to be joined by a physician from Barrow Neurological Institute recently for the most recent blog that we're going to post later this week on the topic of AI. There's a lot of hype, as you know. It was virtually impossible at RSNA, this past RSNA, to avoid messaging on AI, even from vendors that have no business talking about AI. It's such a big wave, almost like a tidal wave or tsunami of AI coming our way, with the unrealistic expectation that the healthcare industry can just indiscriminately absorb all this. So in terms of what does it take to play in that space? Well, again, we learned empirically this. We were brought in a couple of years back by one of our largest customers on the East Coast. They're running a sector PACS, and they were engaging with a research organization to build some algorithms in the area of mobile apps. And so their requirement was to take 2 million exams from their sector PACS and de-identify the data in a very structured manner and make the data available in a cloud infrastructure for the researchers. And so think about all the dimensions of this. So on the one side, you have a PACS that's being used every day in patient workflow. So you don't want to disrupt that by doing a massive Dicom query retrieve project on a sector PACS. Whether it's a Sectra or Fuji or whatever, Dicom query retrieve is going to tax the computing capabilities of that system and is going to slow down patient operations. So instead, what we did was gain direct file level access to all the patient records, de-identify them, then run them through a QA process before they left the hospital, and then shared them on Amazon Web Services with a separate account created for the research organization. That was our entry point into the world of machine learning and neural networks. We have since come a long way. We're now partnered with Google to create some very exciting new technologies. And while not actually creating algorithms of our own, we're instrumental in feeding these algorithms the data that they need. So we did a little research with Google, and we found that empirically speaking, it takes 100,000 or so individual instances of an image for an algorithm to reliably learn what it's looking at. And so you can't really take a deep learning approach for medical imaging. You still need to label images and tell an algorithm what it's looking at 100,000 times in a row with different images before it becomes reliably able to recognize what anatomy it might be looking at on a new image. And so think about the sheer number of images needed for an algorithm to learn multiple things. So for it to learn 10 different things, you would need theoretically 1 million images, separate images that have been de-identified before you can feed them to the algorithm, because you don't want this algorithm that could potentially be used in thousands of places to introduce a data breach or a vulnerability on the HIPAA side. And so, very interestingly, the de-identification process, also something that should be trivial, needs to be very thoughtful. And so we were asked by our customer to make sure that as we are de-identifying all the data, that the chronology of creation of all those exams was kept intact. So you could still tell, even though the dates were de-identified, you couldn't tell when the study was taken, you could still tell the lapse of time between the studies and which studies still belong to the same patient versus multiple patients. And so we were the recipients of an 8-page long statement of work explaining in a lot of intricate detail how each of the Dicom headers was to be handled, and it was not indiscriminate. And then they brought in a third-party auditor to ensure that the algorithm we created for them, first of all, did the job that they requested, and second of all, did not introduce any kind of vulnerability or violate any safe harbor rules. And so once they felt that this algorithm was safe, they placed it into production, and they started de-identifying the 2 million exams, and everybody's happy. And so what that opens up is kind of a whole new world of possibilities. Not every enterprise imaging environment is appropriate for participating in machine learning. For example, and Chris, this is something that I've actually meant to ask you previously. You, as an enterprise FRG, aren't technically the owner of those images. The hospitals that you read for are the owners of those images. So you, as an organization, would not be necessarily a good candidate to participate in a de-identified data lake with Dicom Systems and Google, because you can't, on behalf of your customers, decide to de-identify the data and make it available. Is that correct?
You got it.
So that right there kind of eliminates, all radiology groups and teleradiology groups that do reading on behalf of their customers. However, the hospitals themselves are all potentially candidates to participate and contribute various types of data to create various forms of algorithms. And so what that brings us to is this really disappointing process that took place at RSNA. And it's disappointing, but it's also very exciting to see these thousands of companies and universities and PhD students and research organizations that are creating algorithms to teach machines how to recognize various things. So the first thing to recognize is that we're nowhere near going to be replacing or ever replacing physicians with machines. So what's interesting is that the FDA today considers an algorithm as nothing more than a medical device. So that's an interesting distinction, right? It's an algorithm, it's a piece of software, and you're teaching it to do something, but to the FDA, it's a medical device. And so they're going to be judging that medical device on its ability to enhance the physician's workflow, not on its own intrinsic accuracy. So that's really interesting, right? So that algorithm could be 85 and 90% accurate, but it doesn't matter. We really want it to be 95 to 100% accurate or 99% accurate, but even if it's 85 to 90%, excuse me, it's still being judged by how effectively is it assisting a physician to be more efficient in the detection of disease. And so from the perspective of teaching an algorithm to do something, we're not saying in any way that those algorithms are going to become physicians, because then you get into the whole argument of, well, who's going to peer review those artificial intelligent physicians, and who's going to be ensuring that they're not biased, right? Whoever is teaching those algorithms might have a certain bias, and so if you're teaching algorithms with a bias, then how reliable are they in the long run? How objective are the algorithms in the first place? Because they will be taught with the unique perspective or subjective perspective of the physicians who train the algorithm. So, this whole AI and medical imaging commentary is hugely influential in what we do, and it's inevitably going to affect us, and it's going to bring a lot of really interesting questions to the table in terms of ethics and where does medicine go from here. But I wanted you guys to get a perspective on what it takes to teach a machine learning algorithm before you can consider any kind of artificial intelligence discussion. And so going forward, just be very skeptical about what a vendor might come to you and say, well, here's a new algorithm we just developed. Well, who provided the input for creating that algorithm in the first place? And so we're getting into a discussion now with the ACR and hopefully the ACC as well on the cardiology side to create kind of a shopping list or a wish list that would be coming from the physicians versus technology companies proposing technology that doesn't have a home. It's much better to tell the vendors, okay, these are the top 10 algorithms we would be willing to spend money on because they will enhance our workflows. And so we're advocating as a company that these organizations need to take the lead, as representatives of these various physician professionals, to take the lead and say, we are gathering information, and Mr. Physician, Mr. Radiologist, Mrs. Cardiologist, what are the top things, pain points that you think could be useful to you as a physician? And then give that list to the vendors, and then we can have a really productive conversation about an effective commercialization of machine learning in healthcare. So I'm going to stop here. I think we need to start answering questions that may have been posted to Taylor. So Taylor, I'll let you take it from here.
All right, thank you, Florent. That concludes the presentation portion of the webinar. Now we'd like to open up the floor to questions. I did receive a question earlier. It looks like the person who sent it in removed it, but it was about sending to different modalities like MRIs and ultrasounds and what's done for that. I think that was aimed at you, Florent.
Sure. It's probably a little bit hard to answer it accurately if it was removed, but it really doesn't matter the type of modality that we are providing Worklist to, as long as it speaks Dicom. Right? So if we're talking about an older modality that has some either antiquated or Dicom that hasn't been updated in a long time, it might need to be updated by the vendor to the most recent Dicom standards. But essentially, if we are able to receive an HL7 order or any kind, an ADT, something that gives us the patient demographics that are going to go into those study headers, we can provide Worklist to any modality, including these modalities that historically have not been part of enterprise imaging, like Stryker cameras, Olympus cameras, Canon, all those visible light and secondary capture devices that don't necessarily produce Dicom originally. So I hope that partially answers the question.
Yes, I see the question again, and let me read it. It was, how do you prefetch priors comparison images when you could have multiple priors, such as CT, MRIs, ultrasound, PETs, etc.?
Yeah, I think that could be effectively answered by Chris because that goes to the Prefetch engine that he was describing for us. Chris, do you want to take this?
Absolutely. So when you build your prior fetch rules in the platform, you can specify almost any, I shouldn't say almost, any Dicom element can be part of a filter or excluded as a filter. So for instance, if you get that chest, abdomen, and pelvis CT current study, and there was a prior chest x-ray, a prior PET that included chest images, maybe even a cardiac ultrasound or something like that. We wouldn't normally fetch, but anyway, that's not the point. The point is that you can incorporate modality into your prior fetch logic. So sometimes you want it to always match modality. For instance, if you're reading a mammo study, you probably want to just look at mammo priors. And I'm not clinical, so that might be an incorrect statement. Maybe a breast ultrasound will be relevant as well. But sorry for that example. But the point is, you can use any Dicom element in your filters when you build your prefetch rule. So you know, for us, we have a tiered, a step rule where we basically are first looking for exact match on prior procedure description. Then we're looking for body part matching with same modality. Then you can look for body part match from any modality, and you can code it such that you pull, let's say your number is 8. You want 8 priors that match your hierarchy. You can code the prefetch rule to do exactly that. So really, the sky's the limit, and if you can sort of dream up the business rule for prior fetching, there's a way to code it and make it real.
Thanks for answering that one, Chris. We have a question from John. Looks like he is looking for a recommendation for PACS. The question is there one PACS that stands out for ease of connectivity, interfacing, and support?
So thank you for the question, John. So I'm going to try to as diplomatically and vendor neutrally answer the question, because we as a company are 100% vendor neutral. It doesn't matter to us what PACS we're presented with. The level of flexibility and willingness to integrate is usually the lowest common denominator is going to be, or the weakest link, I should say, is the PACS vendors' willingness to interoperate with other vendors. And so we have found various levels of rigidity on the part of the vendors that we play with, and the spectrum is pretty wide, as you know. We happen to have several vendors that work closely with us, who come to us to solve problems with them for their clients. So there are several vendors who are who can put the ego aside and say, Mr. Customer, you know, we're not going to be able to solve this problem for you for at least another 2-3 years from a product management perspective. Let us bring in Dicom systems to help solve the problem. And I would say from a flexibility perspective and willingness to help the customer, first, the top vendors that we like to work with, and again, it's not an endorsement because we work with all of them, but in the top position, I would put Sectra and Infinite as vendors that are very flexible and that we enjoy working with. It's very convivial for us to get a project done. There's no ego, there's no, you know, they think about their client first and then they figure out the rest later. And so we do have some, you know, preferences, but recommendations, I would say, should be a function of your own scrutiny and due diligence on those vendors. And then if you have a short list and you say, you know, who do you think we should go with? You know, we'll give you an honest assessment of, you know, who's going to be easiest for us to work with. But ultimately, the choice is going to be up to your physician leadership, who is expected to read on those platforms, and the CIO, who's expected to perform that implementation for them. I hope that answers.
Can I contribute?
Yeah, please.
As well? So from a customer perspective, and I'm actually a customer of Dicom Sys, but I'm a service provider to the radiology group to the hospitals. We don't normally get a say in what PACS platform the hospitals are utilizing. And so what I will tell you is, if you're trying to integrate with a PACS platform, you're going to need tools. Any integration requires a tool. So most of us on the call are familiar with HL7 engines, and we all have HL7 engines that we utilize. and I think Dicom Assist gets into that space as well. But the tool that you need to take data from one place and put it to another is a very important tool in your enterprise imaging workflow. And for me, you know, and having been responsible for what we're doing here at Foundation for 7 years, I'm pretty happy with Dicom systems in the ability to accomplish those integration requirements. So there are certainly some that are more difficult than others, but we haven't encountered a scenario yet that we couldn't overcome or achieve.
All right, thank you for adding on to that, Chris. And the last question is, I believe you would be the best person to answer this. It's about whether you had to install anything at your customer sites. So by that, I'm assuming a network appliance.
Yep, absolutely. So so the Dicom systems platform, we utilize it as an image router or store and forward server, depending on, you know, what nomenclature we're using that day. But yes. So there is a local device that can be installed, and I say can be instead of must be, because we have some customers that are very small, have very low volumes, and they just push across the network to our central router, where we host a couple of Dicom systems routers internally as well, as kind of like a central routing appliance. Yes, so we typically do deploy something at the client hospital, and what's nice about it is the devices can kind of be, you know, they don't have to be large to route a decent amount of data. So we'll have customers with, you know, 300,000 studies annually that, you know, everything routes quite well through a single 1U server. But what we've seen more prevalently lately is our customers choosing to allow us to install this virtual appliance on their hypervisor. And that's a pretty common implementation for us today, and that makes it really easy from a hardware repair, you know, perspective, and from a deployment perspective. We don't have to ship boxes around or do anything. We just send them the OVA, and we go to town with the virtual server.
Okay, thanks, Chris. And we have time to answer one more question. I received this from Todd, and it's for you, Chris. He wants to know if Foundation is matching priors from different hospitals with different URN numbers or medical record numbers.
The short answer is no. We don't act as a integrated health exchange or anything like that. So we don't try to do, you know, confidence matching or anything like that between hospitals. And many of our hospitals are geographically diverse enough that that really isn't applicable. But we do have some hospitals that utilize MPI within a number of their hospitals. So, for instance, we might provide service to, you know, 2 hospitals that share a platform but may not have the same MRNs. When they give us the MPI, or the Master Patient Index, when they provide that to us, we do make that link between studies and make those priors available to our doctors. But generally speaking, we don't try and assume, or assume is not the right word, but we don't try to algorithmically determine which is the same patient from site to site. So what we would typically do, if there are outside films for a particular case, the hospital taking the current exam would be responsible for merging those outside films into their packs, and then they make those images available to us.
So from a technical perspective, Todd's question can definitely be answered in a positive way. It's not necessarily applicable to what FRG does as a radiology group, but we do have instances of clients that do have a very heterogeneous environment. And for example, Dignity Health in Phoenix uses some of our technology to provide some telerad services to other regional hospitals that don't belong to Dignity Health. And so there's a very specific area, you know, geographically, where people do move around quite a bit. You've got Banner Health, you've got Dignity Health, you've got the Barrow Neurological Institute, you've got a lot of different health systems where patients do go interchangeably for healthcare services. And so we have the ability, for example, to bring in images. For example, the primary read will be done at St. Joe Hospital in Phoenix. We obviously can bring the relevant priors from Oasis Hospital locally, and perhaps also images from Ambra Health, which is another, kind of a cloud PACS vendor to Dignity Health. They used to be called by Dicom Grid. Most of you are probably familiar with that brand. So they have a cloud archive, or a Candelis cloud PACS archive that contains relevant priors. Well, those priors definitely should end up in the radiologist's worklist as relevant priors. And we have the ability to do that, whether it's a on-premises PACS, PACS connection via HTTPS across the network, or a connection to a cloud PACS like Ambra Health or Candelis. So we have that capability. It's definitely there.
All right, thank you for that, Florent. That concludes our webinar today. We encourage you to stay in touch with us at dcmsys.com. You can shoot us an email at the sales email address. If you are attending HIMSS next month in Las Vegas, we'd love to see you. We do have a booth there, and we will be a featured vendor at the Interoperability Showcase. We're going to continue to do these webinars. Looks like people are really interested in them, and we're glad to have a conversation with anybody who wants to learn about our solutions and our area of expertise out there. I'll be announcing the date for the next webinar soon. We like to have them just about every quarter. In the meantime, make use of the handouts that are included here on the link. If you didn't get a chance to download them, I'm glad to follow up and send you them as well. I'm sorry we weren't able to get to all the questions today. I'll make sure to touch bases with you offline.
We can definitely answer all those questions via email or separate conversation. Yeah. We're happy to do that. And so I wanted to make sure and thank everybody for their participation in today's webinar. This was like we said, our first in hopefully what will be a long series of webinars. And every time we will have a different speaker, guest speaker joining us. The next one will be Dr.